Psychiatry Department at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He and his colleagues have pursued research there with entheogens for the past 15 years. They've been doing it for a long, long time. He is a clinician in private practice in Baltimore. And Bill, to my knowledge, started the first study in 1962, I think, or maybe 1961. It goes back even farther than these 15 years in your bio, but you can tell them about that. His graduate training in clinical psychology and the psychology of religion included studies at Yale University, the University of Andover Newton Theological School, Brandeis University, and Catholic University. After encountering psilocybin research in Germany in 1963, he pursued psychotherapy research with LSD, DPT, MDA, and psilocybin at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center from 1967 to 1977. That answers that question. Columbia University Press has released his new book, which is in the back corner here. If you don't have your own copy, I highly recommend it to you. Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics, and Religious Experiences. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Richards.
Thank you, Janice, and welcome everyone. It's an honor to be here and to say namaste to each of you in Namaste Hall, no less. Don't get to do that very often. I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say. You know, when I was in graduate school, I hoarded books, and I kind of believed that every book was worth owning, and everyone who wrote a book was a great man or a great woman. And I had all my books perfectly alphabetically organized, so that when you came into my room at Yale, this pink cover hit you immediately that said, "Can we explain the poltergeist?" and I kind of went from that to the opposite view that, you know, a lot of books really aren't worth owning. And a lot of books were written by people who needed to write something to keep their professorships. And they were probably out of print within 2 years. And so people would come to me and say, "Bill, are you going to write a book?" I'd say, "I don't need to do that. You know, I've written some articles, I've said what I need to say, and that's enough." But in the fall of 2013, I got to address the conference, or a seminar at the conference of the American Academy of Religion that happened to meet in Baltimore. This is a group of university professors of religion. And I talked about the religious implications of psychedelic research, which I thought just might be relevant to religious scholars. You know, they kind of catch on after all the sociologists and psychologists have moved on. And at the end of the presentation, this very attractive woman came up to me and offered me a book contract. And somehow it sort of felt right. And Wendy Lochner from Columbia University Press. Actually, I haven't seen the woman since she offered me the contract. We've had some wonderful emails together. She's been a great editor to work with. But anyway, in the next year, the book kind of just tumbled out of me. And I discovered, gee, I really did have something to say. And, you know, I went to a cabin on Lake Superior for a week to write, because that's what writers do, you know. And but really enjoyed writing, and there was very, very minimal editing. It just kind of came out. And when it was done, I just felt it's done. You know, I didn't obsess about if only I had said more about that, or why did I say that, or I wish I could change that. It's the feeling it is what it is, and I offer it to you. I feel almost like I'm not just speaking for myself in the book, but I'm speaking for a whole community of people who are attuned to the profundity of research with psychedelic substances. And even more than psychedelic substances, really, this is about human consciousness and about these profoundly transformative and beautiful and meaningful states of consciousness, a whole spectrum of them, but especially what we call mystical consciousness. And I think most of you know that when we use the term mystical consciousness, we're not talking about something misty or vague, but we're talking about a very, hesitate to use the word specific, but a state of awareness deep in the core of our being that has a sense of unity, a sense of transcendence of time and space, has intuitive knowledge, a sense of sacredness, awesomeness, usually is coupled with feelings of love or joy or peace or purity, and is always described as ineffable. You know, our research subjects at Hopkins always duly write up a report of their experiences because we made them promise to do that when we accepted them into the research project. But there's always a paragraph, you know, grumble, I'll do the best I can, but there's no way I can put this into words. You know, this is beyond language and beyond the categories of human thinking. And this mystical consciousness we've come to, at least I would argue that it's evidence of the so-called perennial philosophy. It's in each of the great world religions, there's a word that points to it. You know, samadhi, nirvana, Sakya-Mutla in Judaism, the beatific vision in Christianity, Wu Wei in Taoism, Fana in Islam, and so on. That it just seems to be something that's intrinsic to the human organism. And it can be facilitated in many different ways. Not everyone has to take psychedelic drugs. And actually, there are many people who take psychedelics who don't have this experience. But it happens in some wonderful meditative states. It happens in sensory isolation and sensory flooding. Sometimes it happens in natural childbirth. We guys just can't explore that option. Sometimes it happens in the midst of creative performance or athletic heights, the runner's high, whatever. But it's just there. And some people would say it comes purely as a gift of grace. You know, some people just wake up in the middle of the night and poof, there it is, you know. And it's so profound in its many variants. But I like to distinguish between the visionary states of consciousness, where there's an ego, your everyday personality, kind of looking, beholding, relating to something that's incredibly inspiring. But it's within what we call the subject-object dichotomy. You know, and then there's the unitive mystical consciousness, where the ego or everyday personality seems to die and be immersed in this unitive state, sort of like the Hindu drop of water merging with the ocean, and then the rebirth of the ego afterwards. So I would define that as, you know, the complete mystical consciousness. Then we have discovered or validated at Hopkins that these mystical states, when they happen, are there more than a wonderful emotion. You know, and not wonderful emotion, it's great, you know. It can be glorious, beautiful, magnificent, inspiring. But these states also include knowledge. And that is why I called this little book Sacred Knowledge. The title came to me at 3 a.m. one morning. I said, that's it. And then we asked, well, what do you know? What's the knowledge? And the basic, most common tenets of response to that question are, if you will, the reality of God, or whatever your favorite noun is for ultimate being. You can call it the ground of being, or oops, sorry. Yeah, you can call it countless names. The nameless, the force, the source, Brahman, take your pick. But that there is something deep in the core of each of us, it appears, that is profoundly sacred and really very wonderful. There's also usually a claim of the immortality of the soul, if you will. That consciousness from within that experience seems obviously indestructible. We could argue, well, maybe that's one big, wonderful delusion. But when you're in there, it is really convincing. And how could anyone think otherwise? It's just obvious. It's sort of like, is water wet? Yeah, the water's wet. Is consciousness destructible? Of course not. Let's try again here. Another tenet of insight often relates to what is called the interrelatedness of humankind, or the brotherhood of man. That within this great unity, yes, you might. Within this great unity, there's kind of an intuitive insight that all humanity, if not every atom of the universe, are somehow, thank you, somehow interconnected. That there is something called the family of man that we all are part of. And of course, that has wonderful implications for ecology and saving our planet. There's insights about beauty. We tend to think of beauty as kind of an aesthetic individual judgment, but in those states, it's just obvious that these images of precious stones and gods and goddesses and in intricate multidimensional geometric patterns are just awesomely intrinsically beautiful, as if beauty is just built into the nature of reality. You know, we see this stuff with our eyes closed. You know, what's going on? You know, I like to think that's a real frontier of science and perhaps of physics to begin to understand how that happens. But we know that it happens. So it's that type of insight that I call knowledge. Further, this knowledge, when it happens, seems to be therapeutic. And in psychotherapy, it changes the self-concept. Once you experience this dimension of consciousness, and the memory stays, you don't have to keep taking the drug, you know? But when you come back to this world, the memory is still there. You know, just maybe as if you had gone to Paris and come back or something. You still remember what it was like in that sidewalk cafe in the cathedral, you know? And like you've been somewhere, you've experienced something, and you've come back. And the memory of it is intrinsically nurturing. And so, for example, in the treatment of addictions, if you take the typical addict, alcoholic, narcotic addict, we've been working at Hopkins with nicotine addicts, you know, people who have tried and tried and tried to get control of their addictions and have failed over and over and over. And often these people have an intrinsic sense of kind of failure, defeat, low self-worth. Once this mystical consciousness is vividly in memory, it's like, well, of course I can get control over my addiction. You know, there are resources within me I can trust that I never knew were there. You know, what AA calls the higher power. You sense, my gosh, it's really there. I can draw on it, I can trust it. When you have experienced this intensity of beauty, you can't view yourself as worthless anymore, you know? The self-talk just doesn't work, you know? It's like this little voice says, who are you trying to kid, you know better, you know? And there may be humility, but it doesn't come out of shame and low self-worth. It comes out of a sense of awe towards the greatness of being. In my book, there are 19 chapters, and 3 of the latter ones are implications for medicine, implications for education, and implications for religion. But I like to stress the implications for education, that, you know, medical treatment is great, and I'm all for using these substances in medicine, and it looks like we're going to really be doing that in the very near future, especially in terms of palliative care and hospice work. I think that may be the first place where psilocybin especially becomes legally applied, which is pretty inspiring. But there's also knowledge to be had for example, with religious professionals. I'm doing a study right now at Hopkins with my colleagues on that provides 2 high-dose psilocybin sessions for professional religious leaders, clergy of all different world religions. And, you know, might the day come when seminary education would include a weekend workshop? Never a required course, for sure, but where those who were healthy enough and so motivated could receive a psychedelic in a safe setting and have a profound religious experience of one kind or another. Why not? Or why shouldn't a philosophy student who's trying to understand Plato experience something akin to what Plato experienced? You know? That it's experiential learning, and why shouldn't that become part of education? I've never done this before, but at Janice's suggestion, I'm going to read you a little bit. And then I look forward to just general discussion with all of you, and we'll go wherever the group would like to go. So there's this section where I talk about all the different triggers of mystical and not only mystical states, but psychodynamic insight. And then I say, what makes the responsible use of psychedelic substances so important is that it provides reliability and potency as compared with the typical meditative experiences, for example. For the first time in the history of science, these two factors allow these revelatory states of consciousness, and any changes in physical or mental health or in attitudes or behavior that may follow them to be studied carefully and systematically within the context of academic research. No longer is the study of mysticism limited to the scholarly scrutiny of historical documents, such as the beautifully expressive writings of Saint Teresa of Avila, Meister Eckhart, Rumi, or Shankara, nor is it limited to the noble attempts to express the subtle shifts of awareness encountered in meditative disciplines within the structural limitations of human language. Profoundly sacred experiences are now occurring in the laboratories of medical professionals and social scientists. Expanded into a larger perspective, the issue of the relationship of these particular molecular compounds to inner experiential content fades into the enigmatic question of the relationship of the human nervous system to consciousness, and perhaps still further into the mystery of matter itself, those atomic and subatomic energies that form the cells of our bodies and brains and dance within and between them. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit paleontologist who suggested that we all actually are spiritual beings who right now are having human experiences, called matter the divine milieu. He described a powerful mystical experience of his own in a poetic essay titled The Spiritual Power of Matter, published in his book, Hymn of the Universe, including these lines: Son of man, bathe yourself in the ocean of matter. Plunge into it where it is deepest and most violent. Struggle in its currents and drink of its waters. For it cradled you long ago in your preconscious existence, and it is that ocean that will raise you up to God. For those who like to quote scriptures, the words of St. Paul in his first letter to the young church in Corinth merit reflection. Quote, for the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are. Unquote. A psychologist colleague of mine, Roland Fisher, in order to remind himself how little we really know, always kept on the left rear corner of his desk a framed photograph of a monkey staring wide-eyed at his own image in a mirror and scratching his head. Profound questions arise for all of us who wonder what we might really be and who then eventually have to come to terms with death. Those who have experienced mystical consciousness almost universally report that they find the reductionist assumptions of many scientists and non-scientists who tend to simply assume that consciousness is caused by brain activity alone to be less than compelling. In spite of the fascinating advances being made in neuroscience, linking mental states with chemical changes, electrical activity, or alterations of blood flow and oxygen content in certain areas of the human brain, correlation is not necessarily causation. Among alternative theoretical approaches is the philosophy of Henri Bergson, a French philosopher popular in the early 20th century, recently reintroduced by C. William Barnard, Southern Methodist University, who wrote the introduction to my book. Wonderful guy. Anyway, Bergson viewed the brain as a reducing valve, akin to a television set that may modify or selectively focus content that does not originate within itself. Similarly, one may refer to the wise caution of Tenzin Gyatso, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, who in his book, This Universe in a Single Atom, wrote that, quote, "The view that all mental processes are necessarily physical processes is a metaphysical assumption, not a scientific fact," and observed that current neuroscience does not have any real explanation of consciousness itself. Karl Jaspers, my hero, a German psychiatrist and philosopher who, with his Jewish wife Gertrude, suffered through World War II, repetitively reminded the readers of his many books that we are fundamentally more than we know, or perhaps ever can know, of ourselves. When we attempt to organize vivid descriptions or actual memories of mystical and visionary experiences within the filing systems of our rational minds, we find that our current linguistic skills and cognitive categories are very primitive. It does not suffice to describe a revelatory insight as a mere electrical impulse, or an emotion as the squirt of a hormone. Love, nobility, the creative yearnings to strive toward and express excellence and what we humans call greatness are manifestations of that part of the mystery of our beings that we call spiritual. The same is true of dedication and courage to care about our human foibles and the commitments we make to work towards the resolution of personal, societal, and international impasses. The mystics, past and present, are not only those who have glimpsed an ultimate eternal harmony and somehow managed to remember it. Many of them are also known to have returned to the simple disciplines of everyday existence, to chop wood and carry water. That is, to have become incarnate in the world and grounded within time. Perhaps the most highly evolved minds among us come close to genuinely living in both worlds, the eternal and the temporal. In the language of Christian theology, this could be seen to mirror, however faintly, the archetype of the Christ who is fully divine and fully human, capable of experiencing both the agony of the crucifixion and the joy of resurrection. In the language of Buddhist theology, the Bodhisattva humbly walks the streets of the marketplace, dedicated to compassionate involvement in serving others. And then jumping 15 chapters to a chapter called Fears of Awakening. I feel like I'm reading a bedtime story. Don't fall asleep, guys. One reliable effect of visionary and mystical states of consciousness is that they awaken us once again to more fully experience awe. Instead of taking life for granted as we perform our routines in everyday existence, suddenly the very fact that we are at all may seem like a miracle. It was the German philosopher Wilhelm Gottfried von Schelling who apparently first captured the attention of scholars by asking, why is there something and not nothing? The fact that we are at all is pretty incredible when we think about it, even if most of us only have an adventure on Earth that lasts 100 years or less. The memory of my first philosophy professor, Arthur Monk at Albion College, comes to mind, who in class discussions would sometimes become very excited and animated, exclaiming, "What a wonderful question," irrespective of whether or not anyone had any idea what the answer might be. In the wake of mystical consciousness, there tends to be a certain freshness of being and an openness to new perspectives on reality. Typically, there is little question that our intellects are very primitive, peering into the unknown on the edge of an incredibly vast mystery. While browsing in a German bookstore after my first glimpse of mystical consciousness as a young student, I was 23 years old, I found my attention captivated by a little book by Josef Müller titled Vielleicht ist alles anders, Maybe Everything is Different. I bought it for the title alone. Another title that intrigued me in those days was Alfred North Whitehead's The Adventures of Ideas. Even those ideas, even those that significantly influence civilizations and the course of history, rise and fall in the potency of their influence and sometimes morph into new forms. Why is it that some of us in the human family apparently do not want to see more than routine existence? Is it fear of the unknown? Is the world too big and scary to even try to think about it? Is it even fear of being surprised or being wrong or not being in control? Might there be a gene for philosophizing or spiritual questing that only becomes expressed in some of us at certain times in life? When people have come to me for help with their fears of flying in airplanes, I have sometimes wondered if I should mention to them that we have always been flying on a little planet that spins at the equator at a speed of about 1,000 miles per hour and that zooms around the sun every year at around 67,000 miles per hour. Much as we like to affirm our independence in everyday life, it remains true that when we eventually find ourselves lying on our deathbeds, we all have to come to terms with an ultimate dependency on realities far greater than our egos. Why is it that I think of the title of the book by C.S. Lewis, Surprised by Joy? I recall one of the theological students with whom I was asked to sit as he experienced his first psilocybin session in Dr. Leuner's clinic. This was in Göttingen in Germany in 1963. This is when I started being a psychedelic guide. I didn't know much about the art of guiding sessions then, and should have been alerted when he turned his back to me, buried his face in the inner corners of the couch cushions, and remained silent and non-responsive to my attempts to communicate with him. Finally, as the effect of the entheogen was waning, he exclaimed, "Ich habe es geschafft," means I made it. It turned out that during the entire session, he had experienced a whirlpool that steadily attempted to draw him into a vortex leading into the depths of the ocean. Instead of affirming trust and diving into the depths, allowing the visionary waters and even his apprentice guide to support him, he had spent the entire time swimming valiantly and energetically against the current, and now felt quite exhausted. At least on that day, he missed an opportunity to discover the treasures, whether insightfully painful or joyful, that might have awaited him in the depths of his mind. Psychologically, we would call his behavior resistance and fear of relinquishing control. Another example comes from an unforgettable morning when I visited two different cancer patients, approximately the same age. One happened to be a woman from an exceptionally wealthy family. We prepared for her LSD session sitting beside her swimming pool in a luxurious suburb of Baltimore attended by servants. I recall that she apologized that her living room still had furnishings in it from the prior year since her interior decorator hadn't updated them yet. The other was a poverty-stricken woman who lived in a poorly maintained row house in Baltimore's slums. We met in her kitchen with torn linoleum on the floor and cockroaches, long since accepted as inevitable housemates, literally crawling on our bodies. Both women were confronting the same issue, the imminence of death. Perhaps due to my own limitations, 2 attempts to assist the wealthy person with the help of LSD failed, and she finally died isolated and depressed and bitter. Death was the one thing she could not control, an awareness that triggered a response to life that can best be described as seething anger and sulking. In contrast, the woman in the slums was able to respond to the opportunity provided by the psychedelic substance with openness and gratitude, and approach death with interpersonal warmth and a sense of inner peace. There are many people, including a significant number of mental health professionals, who have come to assume that the use of psychedelic substances is intrinsically dangerous. Without comprehension of dosage, the significance of set, that is personality structure, preparation, and expectations, and setting, the physical and social environment, and the varieties of alternative states of awareness, they have assumed that the responses to entheogens are unpredictable and capricious. Some who have personally ingested one of the psychedelic substances have encountered frightening states of consciousness and appear to have little motivation to come to understand their inner conflicts and unpleasant experiences. Others have known friends, family members, or patients who got into trouble and had used psychedelics, and on that basis assume it is inadvisable for anyone to ingest them. Some psychiatrists know only the mental health casualties that appear in emergency rooms, akin to internists who have to cope with the victims of automobile accidents. They tend not to see those who value beneficial experiences, largely because use outside prescribed medical and religious settings is currently illegal, and psychiatric assistance may not be required. Now, I'm skipping some parts here. If you want to know what I'm skipping, you gotta buy the book. Now, if psychedelic sacraments have the capacity to awaken us to genuinely spiritual knowledge, why would any government fear them, declare them illegal, and go so far as to threaten imprisonment of people who may find certain species of mushrooms growing in their yards? Why is it that current federal regulations in the United States require that the psilocybin approved for research use be kept in a locked safe, bolted to the ground if the safe weighs less than 750 pounds in a secure facility? It is only an intrinsically sacred substance that Indians have calmly used in their religious rituals for at least 3,000 years, if not significantly longer. It is not a radioactive isotope. Yet, at this point in American history, research with these substances requires clearance from 2 federal agencies, the FDA and the DEA, plus careful approval by the local institutional review board. As clearly outlined in a recent article published in Nature Reviews by David Nutt, Leslie King, and David Nichols, the current governmental controls and legal strictures have seriously impeded progress in scientific research with psychedelic compounds internationally. Until very recently, it appeared that government funding would only be considered for research that intended to document some adverse effect of their use. Any studies of potentially positive uses seem to be outside the scope of governmental interest. This situation is especially mind-boggling in countries where many college students and other citizens are choosing to use psychedelics. One would hope that federal agencies with responsibility for the health of all its citizens would want to obtain all information possible about responses to different entheogens by promoting and funding scientific research. To date, unfortunately, this rarely has been the case. It appears that governments, for better or worse, really have been engaged in a plant war. Some would also call it a war within consciousness, and might view it as an evolutionary birth pangs of increasing spiritual awareness in the human species. Perhaps all these cautious safeguards currently in place, extreme and unnecessarily alarmist as they may appear, not to mention frustrating to qualified and dedicated researchers, are understandable as we recover from the cultural traumas of the 1960s, with a clash of values surrounding the Vietnam War, race relations, the women's movement, and the sexual revolution. This cultural conflict in our history is often illustrated by the extreme stereotypes of Western students offering flowers to soldiers, chanting Hare Krishna, and saying "make love, not war" at one pole, and the equally distorted specter of industrial giants exclusively obsessed with immediate economic gains and aggressive military strategies on the other. It might help in the present climate for us to honestly acknowledge that we as a global society have indeed been traumatized, that we appear to have hysterically overreacted, and that we often still tend to be confused and ambivalent in our thinking about entheogenic substances in either plant or pharmaceutically pure forms. As many of us know, the improbable does occasionally happen. We tend to call them incredible coincidences. In May 1943, while British and American fighter planes were dropping bombs on the city of Dortmund, a little blonde girl, 7 years of age, courageously stood beside her papa at the entrance of their neighborhood bunker, watching the spectacular flares in the sky and listening to the deafening explosions. Destruction was everywhere. Most everyone was traumatized. In August 1972, now a 36-year-old psychiatric nurse and my wife, she found herself guiding a terminal cancer patient through a psychedelic session with dipropyltryptamine, DPT, at Sinai Hospital in Baltimore. This man, a former fighter pilot in the US Air Force, had literally sat in the bombing bay of one of those planes, and in repeated attacks had released bombs over Dortmund. He was 20 years old at the time of the bombings, and now at age 49 still recalled how much he enjoyed shooting Nazis. As they held each other's hands during and after his DPT session, sharing their mutual appreciation for Beethoven and Brahms, as well as their human connection in the present. There was also a shared awareness that both had been caught up in powerful currents of world events that dwarfed their individual lives. What now prevailed was acceptance and reconciliation on the threshold of one man's death in a very different period of history. It is always fashionable in times of cultural transition to convene task forces of experts and to call for additional study and research. And such activity is always needed and welcome. At the present time, an increasing number of scientists in various countries are in the process of carefully investigating the safety of the responsible use of different psychedelic substances, and their findings will continue to appear in professional journals. Yet there has been a tendency to ignore the abundance of knowledge that already has been published in years past, as if the wheel needs once again to be reinvented. I hope that if we combine past and present research, and if the safety and potential benefit of psychedelic substances continues to be supported, cultural controls can gradually be relaxed in sane and responsible ways. Their present classification in Schedule 1 in the United States as drugs that have no currently accepted medical use and have lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision is outdated and no longer accurate or appropriate. Whether or not such drugs have a high potential for abuse is debatable. Insofar as they are non-addictive, there was little respect for serious and knowledgeable use when the repressive legislation was enacted. And there are many other substances not listed in any schedule, such as alcohol, caffeine, and nicotine, that also have their own potentials for abuse. Within the next few years, it is anticipated that well-designed studies with increasingly large samples of participants will provide substantial recent data to inform intelligent decision-making. A few final paragraphs here, and then we'll move into discussion. If psychedelic substances, wisely, responsibly employed, are indeed going to become valued tools in understanding ourselves, our fellow human beings, and the universe in which we discover ourselves, many adjustments in our current attitudes, procedures, and laws gradually need to be made. In what ways should legal access and possession be granted? Who should be the guardians held responsible for their wise use? Should mental health professionals be the gatekeepers with psychiatrists writing prescriptions? Should religious professionals decide when one is ready to receive what has been called the sacrament that works? Should membership in a religion where entheogens are accepted as sacraments be required for legal access? Or can freedom of religion be honored outside of affiliation with a particular church, synagogue, temple, or mosque? Can the man on the street be adequately educated or held responsible to obtain the requisite knowledge in order to make his or her own decisions about whether and how and when to use psychedelics? We allow this with alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, and increasingly marijuana, knowing that some will use the substances inappropriately and abusively, while many will use them responsibly. How can the purity, accurate labeling, and proper dosage of psychedelic substances best be ensured so that the probability of safety and effectiveness can be maximized? These are all important questions for us to explore, and the time is now. Personally, I envisage continuing research projects of many kinds that are designed to investigate the promise of responsibly integrating psychedelic substances into our culture. In the immediate future, they will require the approval and oversight of governmental agencies and institutional review boards. Such studies could focus not only on potential medical applications, but as outlined in this book, also on educational and religious uses. Social scientists have the skills to monitor and measure the beneficial or detrimental effects discovered in such studies. Many of these studies could proceed under the aegis of universities and research institutions. Others could occur in experimental retreat centers, some located in scenic natural settings, where people who desire a legal psychedelic experience could apply, receive medical screening and counsel, have access to pure substances in proper dosage, receive competent preparation, guidance, and support as needed during the periods of alternate states of consciousness, and obtain initial integrative assistance in individual or group contexts. Such centers in the countries that would sponsor and support them would be staffed by interdisciplinary professionals, both medical and religious. They would also include teams of social scientists well-trained in procedures of research. I hope to live long enough, if not to participate as a staff member at such a center, at least to have the honor of visiting one. As an American citizen, I would be especially proud if one of the first centers was successfully established in my own country.